Hello, everyone. We're so glad you're with us today. My name is Hannah Zimmerman. I'm Locust Grove's Marketing and Communications Director at Historic Locust Grove. I'm not at Historic Locust Grove. I'm coming to you not from my living room, but from my dining room. And I see so many of you joining, a lot of volunteers, a lot of familiar names, a lot of unfamiliar names. So we'd love to know how you found out about us. If you are having technical difficulties, you can email Jeffrey McMahon, GNCMAHON at locustgrove.org. His information is in the chat. Also in the chat, a link to Gwen's book. I'm going to go ahead and open up our lecture this evening by introducing our Executive Director, Carol Ely. Carol, I think you want to say a few words. Carol, can I? There you are.
You see me? Okay. Hi. Thanks. I'm looking at the names too. It's great to see familiar names and new names. Both are great. And just like to say a few words of gratitude to various people. First to Gwen for agreeing to do this unprecedented format, and I know it will be great. Also to people on the staff who have put this together. Hannah, who has figured out the tech, Jeffrey McMahon, who's assisted with that, other people on the staff who have helped, Brian, who came up with the recipe, and then Jennifer and Debbie and Caitlin, all of whom are working behind the scenes to keep our programs coming and keep our mission fresh. And all of this is, of course, unprecedented, but we hope that we'll be back and seeing you face to face before too long. And in the meantime, our grounds are open. They are lovely since we're able to take such good care of them, and it's springtime in Kentucky, and you are welcome to come and walk the grounds. 55 acres, there's plenty of social distance. And so we're glad that you're here, and welcome, and let's continue.
Thanks, Carol. I think that you're a wonderful director, but I'm going to mute you now. We do ask that everyone keep their microphone turned off throughout the meeting. We are going to be making a recording of this lecture that will be available online. I see that 60 of you have already joined us from as far away as Lexington and New Albany, Indiana, just truly exotic locations. And we're so pleased that we're all able to gather at a virtual Locust Grove today. Oh, I see that someone's from Ohio. Welcome, Ohio, our neighbor to the north-ish. And then also someone who originated in Indiana and was from Florida. I am going to go ahead and turn on the microphone and video for our program director, Brian Cushing. Brian is our historic cocktail aficionado. Brian, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you see me?
We can see you. So Brian, why don't you go ahead and walk us through this 1840s mint julep. For everyone who's just now joining us, there is a link in your email that will be able to show you to a video of Brian drinking and enjoying this. But Brian, why don't you give us a taste right now?
Okay, well, a couple weeks ago, Gwen and I had a brief conversation about what would be good criteria for a cocktail for tonight. And she pointed out that during George Rogers Clark's lifetime, he did sometimes find occasion to enjoy rum. And so that we should do something rum-based. And at the same time, we are doing a historic mint julep series on YouTube. We're kind of working through the steps towards developing the mint julep to where we got to today. And so the perfect recipe popped up to combine the two, the George Rogers Clark event and the julep series with a recipe from 1840 by Joe Redding, who tended bar at the Pearl Street House in Louisville at what's now 3rd and Main Street. So there's going to be a video going up about it, but there's no bourbon in it. There's no kind of whiskey at all. Bourbon was just starting to break through to being a part of the mint julep. So without taking too much of your time, we'll just go through it with the recipe that you have in front of you today. So this one is actually to be made in glass rather than a silver cup. We're going to take a teaspoon of sugar, tablespoon of water, Going to dissolve that, and you can substitute simple syrup if you like. But this is the old-fashioned way to do it, to dissolve the sugar in water. And then we are going to mostly fill the glass with ice with a combination of a couple of lumps and some crushed ice. This is the Dr. John Croghan era at Locust Grove, by the way, with Mr. Redding's recipe here. And so then we're going to take our 3 spirits. One is cognac, and we are just using Hennessy tonight. So it's 1 ounce or 2 tablespoons of that. Pour that over your ice. The same amount of, it calls for Jamaica rum, but one of our distillery sponsors who's helped us out quite a bit is Spirits of French Lick. They have an excellent rum out now that has just the flavor that this drink needs. Pour that over it, and then 2 ounces of port. And that just drifts down through it and makes a wonderful purple color. We'll take a few loose mint leaves, put that on top. Go to our cocktail shaker. Pour that all in, give it about 10 shakes. Back into the cup. Rub around the edge with a lemon. Get at least 2 mint stalks. Rub them up between your hands, get the scent moving. Put them in the drink with your straw. Snip that straw off right about at the mint so that the aroma really gets you. And there you have it. Absolutely nothing like what we consider a mint julep today, but it contains George Rogers Clark's favorite rum. It's a taste of the 1840s in Louisville, and hope you enjoy it and the lecture.
Thank you, Brian. I think you're a great bartender, but I am going to mute you now. Everyone, thank you so much for being with us. Just a reminder, if you do encounter any difficulties, please send an email to me or Jeffrey. We'll be monitoring the situation the whole time. I also wanted to let you know how you can change the view on your screen really quickly. Right before I introduce Gwen, we do want to keep Gwen in the spotlight. So in the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom screen, there should be something that says speaker view or gallery view. If you choose speaker view, you will get Gwen up close and personal once we turn on her video. Gwen, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you now. Right now, you're just seeing my name, but don't worry about it, guys. And in just a minute, we'll share my screen for a PowerPoint. We'll still be here. You can buy Gwen's book. Thank you so much for being here. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Gwen. Gwen, are you ready to be introduced?
I'm ready.
Okay, great. Gwynne Potts is the former executive director and board chair of Historic Locust Grove. A graduate of Western Kentucky University, she's the author of 2 books on George Rogers Clark, William Croghan, and Locust Grove. She has also worked with Blackacre State Nature Preserve, also in Louisville, and Liberty Hall Historic Site in Frankfort, Kentucky. Gwen was also a chair. You were not? You didn't work for Liberty Hall? That's a mistake. Gwen, she worked for Blackacre, not Liberty Hall. Gwen was a chair of the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial Celebration in Louisville in 2006. Take it away, Gwen.
Thank you. I was the co-chair of the 2006 with Lamar Gaston. We can't forget that. So thank you, Hannah. We're working without a net tonight. So I hope everyone has a drink, whether it's Brian's or not. Enjoy something. There are at least 2 good reasons to study history, I used to tell my students when I was still teaching. And the first reason, of course, is that some of us actually enjoy understanding the circumstances and events of ancient events, people, places, what have you. Most of them didn't buy into that, so I had to come up with a second reason, and that was because it's important to understand the lessons of history. And I don't mean memorizing names and dates. I mean, if we don't understand the social, political, economic and religious incentives that were driving people and events from the past, we have learned nothing about history. So I began George Rogers Clark and William Croghan in an attempt to understand the American Revolution through the real-life experiences of a regular Continental Army officer and a somewhat irregular Virginia militia brigadier general. Croghan was an Irish-born former junior British officer who spent most of the Revolution with George Washington, and Clark was an equally youthful, dutiful servant to Patrick Henry, George Mason, and Thomas Jefferson. Clark and Croghan fought in different military organizations, one in the militia, one in the Continental Line, frequently against different combatants, and almost always in different locations, but each was driven to defeat British control over America's 13 colonies. Each was keenly aware of his status. Status meant everything to the 18th century man, and each was working toward a very specific personal outcome after the war, and that was economic security. One man succeeded and the other one did not. Hannah, can we have the next pic, please? This is George Rogers Clark. It belongs to the state of Indiana. I think it was made in connection with Indiana's bicentennial. I've been asked tonight to talk about finding George Rogers Clark among the chaos and the revolution of federal America. So we're going to start in the West, on the opposite side of the Appalachian Mountains from where William Croghan rode with Washington, and on the opposite side from where a coterie of slave-owning, land-owning Virginia legislators and their governor, Patrick Henry, laid claim to the Western Territory in the absence of federal law. In the West is where French villagers, British soldiers, Virginia militias and settlers, and eventually even the United States Army, along with thousands of Native Americans, were locked in a deadly struggle that continued for 40 years. This is where we first find Clark as a 25-year-old military and civilian commander on the 18th century American frontier, in the middle of anarchy, terror, and thank goodness, a little idealism. If George Rogers Clark's somewhat feral childhood is dismissed and his indulged decline at Locust Grove is assumed, his life can be organized into a few specific periods of interest, perhaps one and a half generally known to the public. The first one we'll examine is the training period. This is the half-known story that led to his selection as Virginia's Western commander. His late adolescence and early manhood were spent, for the most part, far from his Caroline County, Virginia home, in the Ohio River Valley, where he regularly traveled the roughly 85-mile path between Fort Pitt and Fish Creek in Western Virginia. Fish Creek is about 40 miles south of Wheeling, what is Wheeling today. There was no Wheeling then. There was barely a Fish Creek then. I don't believe there's a Fish Creek today. It's a creek, and it's about 85 miles south of Fort Pitt. Clark became a King's man in 1774 when he was commissioned a Virginia militia captain in the Shawnee conflict known as Dunmore's War. And it was then that he became familiar with most of the characters who would populate his world for the next 12 years. Afterwards, he and other young men of Augusta County, Virginia, hired themselves to the Ohio Company as surveyors and headed to Kentucky for the privilege, as Clark wrote to his father, of taking what lands we want. He spent much of the next 3 years initially surveying, but also acquainting himself with the pioneers at Boonesboro and Fort Herod. And after he was selected by these people to make their dire circumstances known to the Virginia legislature, he traveled to Williamsburg in 1776 to represent them. He succeeded in acquiring gunpowder and in securing Virginia's recognition of its obligation to its Western citizens. He also received a commission as a Virginia Continental Militia Major and was given command of Kentucky's defense. And so he returned to Kentucky in 1777 to what proved to be a killing year. Daniel Boone, Michael Stoner, Simon Kenton, William and Ben Lynn, James Harrod, Ben Logan, and lawyer John Todd became his captains, his deputies, all of whom, with the exception of Kenton, were older than he. Clark abandoned surveying when his full-time occupation that year became survival. And it was this year spent in Kentucky where he estimated that 2,000 souls perished that propelled him into the role for which he is famous and colored his thoughts and his actions for the rest of the Revolution. Hannah, can we have the valley map, please? Thanks. Beginning in 1774, Indian raids into Kentucky had increased in proportion to the number of new territorial settlers, and without exception, the raids were orchestrated and rewarded by the British command at Detroit. So let's take a moment to look at this map. You don't, well, at least I don't, because I see myself right there where Pittsburgh should be. But obviously at the head of the Ohio River, where the Allegheny and the Monongahela come together, is Fort Pitt. Redstone is going to be south, where the little X's all gather and then go back up the Ohio. That's Old Redstone, and that's where Clark picked up the settlers who were going to end up down here at Corn Island. So this is Clark's route. Cincinnati did not exist then. He came down, of course, dropped off the settlers, and he's going to go on his way to Cahokia. But look north. All of this territory that will become Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois was populated by Native Americans who had lived there for thousands and thousands of years. This was their home. If you go all the way up to Lake Erie, you'll see at the northern tip of Lake Erie is Detroit, and their fort was there. From that fort, the British managed to pay, bribe, cajole, whatever they needed to do, most of the Native Americans who lived between the Ohio and Detroit into being their allies. And so the source of the strife between the British and the Americans west of the Appalachians was Detroit. It was the British command at Detroit. The natives who were working for them were their minions. Of course, they were working for their own self-survival, but they were working for Detroit. To Clark's way of thinking, the only way to end the raids into Kentucky was to defeat the fort at Detroit. That was the only way that this slaughter was going to end. And from the very beginning of Clark's adventure, his and Patrick Henry's goal was Detroit. Clark returned to Virginia late in 77, and he proposed a military campaign into these northern lands that separated Kentucky from the Great Lakes, where the French settlers and the Native Americans had lived under a fairly benign British rule since the 1763 Treaty of Paris had ended the French and Indian War. Henry and his new cabinet saw the elimination of the Northwest's British and Native presence, though, as a means not only of encouraging settlement, not only of ending raids into Kentucky, but of strengthening Virginia's position among the new American states. Remember, this is 1777. Their hope to settle the territory depended upon the elimination of the native population there, because as Jefferson wrote to George Rogers Clark, the same world will scarcely do for them and for us. Next picture, please. Patrick Henry is said to have created the largest and most complex unit raised by Virginia during the Revolution for George Rogers Clark, and this is Patrick Henry. He assigned the unit special militia status for the defense of Virginia's Western Territory, and he issued 2 sets of instructions. The first, of course, were meant for public consumption, and they were simply say, you can go to Kentucky and defend Virginia's settlers there. But the second were for Clark alone. And they authorized him to raise 7 companies to attack and maintain the British post at Kaskaskia. Now, why Kaskaskia, Illinois? There were several reasons. One, it had become a well-known colonial trading post. It had been founded by former officers from Fort Pitt. It was a place, and people knew how to find it, and that was important out there. There were very few people there. And another reason is that it was convenient to the Spanish. Patrick Henry had already made an arrangement with his equal number in New Orleans. The Spanish governor in New Orleans was going to provide Clark with goods, ammunition, gunpowder, what he needed. This was a deal Henry had made. There was no Secretary of State of the United States then. There was no United States. Patrick Henry was the Secretary of State and the governor of Virginia. And finally, it was the terminus of a road that ran northeast directly to the British fort at Detroit. So if you're wondering why Kaskaskia, it wasn't even the most important place out there on the Mississippi, but why Kaskaskia? This is why. It could be found. The Spanish were going to bring goods there, and it had a road that went to Detroit. Henry followed his orders days later with another letter to Clark, and he advised him then that the gunpowder already was on the way from New Orleans for the Detroit march. Henry couldn't wait to get this started. And if Clark's Illinois regiment failed and it had no other option, they were told to cross the Mississippi into Spanish Louisiana. Again, this is part of the arrangement that Henry had made with his counterpart in New Orleans. So the plan was made. Clark, hundreds of miles from civilization with 170 men, was to face the British Western Command and its native allies with only his instincts to guide him. Somewhat incredibly, the events that followed secured his laudable place in history. This is Kaskaskia, and Clark captured it, I'm sure you know, in July, along with Cahokia, which is about 80 to 90, depending upon which road you take, miles north of Kaskaskia, very close to St. Louis, and Vincennes. Vincennes had a British fort called Fort Sackville. They were all captured in July 1788 without a loss of life. Clark left Leonard Helm in charge of the fort at Sackville and returned to Kaskaskia. Let me take a moment here to explain this map. That's not a superhighway running down the middle of the page. This is a double page. So if you look to the right, you see the Kaskaskia River. On the east side of the river is a sharp cliff, and at the top of that cliff, on the plateau, you see the letter D. That was the British fort. The Brits had built that 1767, I believe. According to the French, and that was essentially everybody in Kaskaskia, the day the British Army pulled out of the fort, the town went up the cliffs to the fort and burned it down. So all of the government business of the town and the area was actually conducted, if you look back to the map, down in town where the page divide is, right in the center there is, you'll see a cross, that's the Jesuit church, and right across from that is the place where most of the Jesuits lived. This little fenced-in area was the center of everything important that happened in Kaskaskia. The commandant lived in that territory. Everything happened there. There had been a seminary at Kaskaskia. It wasn't in existence in 1778, but the town used the building. And on the night that Clark arrived, they were all at a ball in that building. So again, back to the river, Clark's army approached from the east, of course. Just below where you see the word river in Kaskaskia, there had been an arrangement that boats would be left for them. So they took their clothes off, they rolled their beds and their clothing up with their rifles and slung them around their necks, and shimmied down the hill to their boats, rode their horses or took the boats across the river, came back up the smaller hill there to the west, did not bother to put their clothes back on because they were all wet, and went in to the town and circled the town hall and simply broke the doors down and announced that Virginia was now in charge. The British Lieutenant Governor in Quebec, whose name was Henry Hamilton, left Detroit October 7th. This had happened in July. Hamilton comes down October 7th with 162 soldiers, many of whom were French volunteers who Hamilton had nothing good to say about afterwards, and about 70 native allies about whom Hamilton didn't have a whole lot that was good to say. In any case, they retook Vincennes on December 17th. So now Clark is back in Kaskaskia. He's got men up at Cahokia. He thinks Leonard Helm is in charge of things at Sackville. He learns early in January that, in fact, Henry Hamilton and the Brits have come down from Detroit and taken the fort back. He opted to strike back quickly, writing, "The enemy could not suppose we should be so mad as to attempt to march 80 leagues through a drowned country in the depths of winter." He knew the only hope he had of victory was surprise attack. Let's go back to the, let's keep going there, Hannah, one more. There we go, keep it there. George Rogers Clark's place in American history was born in the icy waters of the Wabash River as he pushed and engaged, encouraged, did whatever he had to do for his men to raise their flagging spirits and to lead by example through about 180 miles of alternately flooded and frozen terrain in order to recapture Sackville. Now let's look at this map. You'll see on the far left, he more or less runs out of land on February 18th. The day they reached this point was the day he said to himself, "What have I gotten myself into?" He looked out at what was supposed to be the Wabash River and saw almost 5 miles of water. It looked like a sea. And the question was, how do I get there? What do I do? How am I going to get my men there? All of the things you can imagine. They spent a couple days there thinking about that. And for those of you who've taken a couple years of French, you will remember that not only Henry Hamilton's army consisted of a number of Frenchmen, so did Clark's. And his French volunteers were a big part of guiding him to Sackville because they knew where there was possibly going to be land in the middle of this flooded terrain. When they leave land on February 21st, they go through first the lower Mamel, which is actually just a hilly rise. If you've been to Vincennes, you know you can almost look to St. Louis if your vision were good enough, that there weren't a curve in the earth. There's just nothing out there. It is flat. So when you run into these little hills, they're points of direction for people who live in the area. The lower Mamel was poking up out of the sea of water in the flood, and they went from there, paddled their way over to the upper Mamel. If you know anything about French, you know the Mamel refers to a female body part, because that's what it looked like coming out of the water. So they hopped, literally, swam, dragged themselves, pulled themselves from one little high land to the other through all of this flood. It took them 6 days to get, 5 days to get 6 miles. So that's how hard it was to move through all of this. They finally reached enough land that they could stay on land on February 24th. And really the evening of February 23rd. and marched into Vincennes about 8 o'clock that night. This is February 23rd, 1779. They spent the 24th firing at the fort, and after some delay, wondering what on earth was going on, the men in the fort began firing back at them. And this went on at about a day and into the night. After about 18 hours, a war party arrived from Kentucky carrying scalps. Clark's moment had arrived. His men immediately rode to meet the party, and they killed several of the warriors. And the others, realizing their situation, dismounted, knelt, pardon me, and prepared for death, as Colonel Hamilton wrote, by singing their death song. So they knew the situation they were in. Clark's major, Joseph Bowman, kept a journal during his service in Clark's regiment, and he recorded what came next. He wrote, "Our men took 6 prisoners, brought them into town, and brought the Indians to the main gate before the fort gate. There, tomahawked them and threw them into the river." Hamilton, who watched this horror from about 100 yards away, wrote that the Indians were placed in the street opposite the fort gate where the poor wretches were to be sacrificed. The blood of the victims was still visible for days afterwards. You know, as Detroit's commander, Hamilton had issued more than 8,500 scalping knives to his native allies, and he had accepted more than 100 scalps from Kentucky. So I'm not certain why he was astonished by witnessing the consequences of his actions, but he was, and apparently this astonishment stayed with him most of his life. Clark, on the other hand, fully understood the effect of the slaughter upon everybody present, and in the stunned silence that followed, calmly asked Hamilton to discuss terms of surrender. "I met him on the parade ground outside the fort," Hamilton wrote. "He had just come from his Indian triumph, all bloody and sweating." Clark later recorded his reason for the orders, and his response was rooted in Kentucky's bloody summer of 1777. He said, "I wanted an excuse to put them to death, otherwise treat them as I thought proper. The cries of the widows and the fatherless on the frontier that they had occasioned now required their blood on my hands." Bowman was circumspect in his journal, and he never identified specifically who killed the natives, but Hamilton clearly suggested it was Clark. In writing this chapter, I came to understand that the Vincennes Indian massacre was a setup. Bowman gave it away when he wrote that our men, having got news of the Indian party from Kentucky, they heard that on one of the islands out here. They knew the party was coming. They had fought all day on the 24th, waiting for this party to arrive. And they immediately went into action when the natives appeared on the horizon. Clark later wrote George Mason that the deaths had the effect that I had expected. The local Indians upbraided the English parties in not trying to save their friends, and gave them to understand that they believed them to be liars and no warriors. The massacre had the effect I expected. Fort Sackville was surrendered to Clark at 10 a.m. the next day, February 25th, 1779. Hamilton wrote, "The colors were not hoisted this morning that we might be spared the mortification of hauling them down, but the rebels had them presently hoisted with their 13 stripes over them." And Fort Sackville then became Fort Patrick Henry. 753 miles from Williamsburg, George Rogers Clark had extended Virginia's western boundary to the Mississippi River. He'd provided Ben Franklin's claim to the Northwest Territory during the Paris peace talks that would come. and he established his place in American history. But at what cost? He immediately began plans for the Detroit campaign. Not yet, Hannah. Let's go back to the other one. Thank you. But before he could organize it, Henry's gubernatorial replacement, who was Thomas Jefferson, ordered instead that a new fort be constructed near the confluence of the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers. So while Clark was on the Mississippi River, a June 1780 joint British and native raid resulted in 350 Kentucky settlers being taken to Detroit as prisoners, and a dozen more killed. Clark responded quickly, but by the time he arrived at Harrodsburg, Jefferson had scrapped plans for the Detroit campaign in favor of an Ohio raid against the Shawnees. Remember, the same land wouldn't do for both. With no advance payment for the raid, he personally paid for supplies and conscripted 4 of every 5 men in Kentucky to march to Ohio for Jefferson. The Pequot and Chillicothe Shawnee villages were their targets. 1,000 men gathered at the falls of the Ohio. Simon Kenton, who had been with him at Kaskaskia, and Ben Logan rode on either side of Clark. And Logan's Lincoln County militia deputy, Daniel Boone, rode at the rear. The militia moved at lightning speed. Clark's armies always were forced to do this, and as usual, they marched through the night. And thanks to one of Logan's men who deserted and informed on them, the Shawnees knew Clark was coming, but they were unprepared for the speedy arrival. The campaign lasted almost 2 weeks and ended with Clark's victory and the destruction of the natives' corn and vegetable supplies that were meant to carry them through the coming winter. And as the battle wound down, I wrote it, but I won't say it, both sides engaged in atrocities. When it was all over, Clark was thought of as the best candidate for regional governor. But more important to him, he was free again to plan for Detroit until Benedict Arnold arrived at the mouth of the James River and floated upstream in January 1781 in search of Thomas Jefferson. Now, as luck would have it, Clark was with Jefferson that first week in January, finally planning the Detroit campaign. Washington sent Wilhelm von Steuben to aid Jefferson, and Clark was immediately assigned by Steuben to the James River to harass the British troops. Jefferson later informed the legislature, who had moved to Richmond and, of course, never came back, that Colonel Clark of Kaskaskia has been sent with 240 men by Baron Steuben, and having properly disposed of the British in an ambush, gave them a deliberate fire that killed 17 on the spot and wounded 13. Benedict Arnold left the James River the next morning, and Clark was elevated to Brigadier General by Jefferson. The Detroit campaign was on. George Rogers Clark is said to have written that his very soul was wrapped in Detroit. If this is so, the events of summer 1781 might explain his subsequent emotional decline. Following Washington's orders, von Steuben sent him to Fort Pitt, where his long friend John Gibson was stationed, along with Major William Croghan, who was there waiting out his parole as a POW from Charleston. Of course, he'd been in Charleston when it fell to the Brits in 1780. Clark had chosen Gibson to be his Detroit second in command, and Washington had written a letter to the fort commander ordering Clark's provisions. So all was in readiness, except that the fort's commander was a Pennsylvanian. And the Pennsylvanians in 1781 were beginning to think that they should control Fort Pitt, go figure, rather than the Virginians. And so he refused to let Gibson or Gibson's detachment join the Virginia campaign to Detroit. Clark wrote to both Washington and Jefferson to explain the situation to them, and he informed Washington that should we fall through and no expedition take place, it's to be feared that the consequences will be fatal to the whole frontier. Fort Pitt militia colonel Archibald Lockery finally was pressed into taking 100 of his Pennsylvanians along with Clark, bringing most of the supplies the fort commander agreed to release. And on August 18th, literally days before he dashed across Pennsylvania to join Washington and Rochambeau on their march to Yorktown, Croghan took a moment to write a letter of forewarning to Virginia's war secretary. He wrote, "General Clark set out from this country with 400 men. He expected 1,500, and he had supplies for 2,000. Doesn't sound good. From every account we have, the Indians are preparing to receive him, so they knew he was coming. And if they should attack him in his present situation, I dread the consequences." Next slide, Anna. Alexander McKee, who had been William Croghan's uncle's closest business partner before the Revolution, and Joseph Brant, whom we see here, the leader of the Mohawk Nation, and by the way, the new husband of William Croghan's cousin, Catherine, waited for Clark at the mouth of the great Miami River on the Ohio. Both Brant and McKee were British officers working out of Detroit. Clark, of course, moved past at night, obscured by the dark, causing Brant and McKee to hang back. They were unsure of the size of his army. The next day, however, Lockery and his men stopped nearby for a meal, and the British Rangers saw immediately that the Detroit expedition's armaments and supplies lay before them. Lockery and 36 other men were made to kneel before they were tomahawked. The survivors were marched to Detroit along with Clark's ammunition. Washington wrote to George Rogers Clark saying, "I feel not only for the public's disappointment, but for your own, as I doubt not you had the affair very much at heart." 63 Americans reached Detroit that summer, not as conquerors, but as prisoners. This was the turning point in George Rogers Clark's career, the beginning of the end of glory and the start of a series of catastrophes that almost ruined his life in a cascade of erratic and sometimes incomprehensible complications that left him despondent and sometimes inebriated. What follows is the story you hear little about with George Rogers Clark. A year later, McKee and Brant organized 300 Hurons, Delawares, Shawnees, and Mingos to retaliate against a Pennsylvania militia's slaughter of more than 90 peaceful Native Americans in northeastern Ohio. Another event many of us know today through William Croghan's letters. Now, this happened because, of course, they were responding to what had happened to Archibald Lockery's militia. So another militia from Pennsylvania rides over the Ohio, goes over into Ohio, what was Ohio territory, and slaughters 90 peaceful Moravian Indians, meaning they were a group of Indians who had lived and become Christians living among the Germans who were settled there. So now, as retribution for that, the Indians attacked Kentucky's Bryan Station settlement in August with a particular vengeance. Consequently, 182 frontiersmen organized to strike back, but they were ambushed August 19th at Blue Lick Springs, where Israel Boone was shot dead standing next to his father, and John Todd, Clark's close friend from the Illinois days, was killed. As a matter of fact, there were 72 Kentucky men killed that afternoon and another 11 taken to Chillicothe as prisoners. Think about the number of people who lived in Kentucky at that time. This was pivotal. The Central Kentucky men blamed Clark, who was continuing as he was ordered at Fort Nelson in a town, as Boone bitterly put it, without inhabitants. Of course, he's talking about Louisville. Kentucky's men again cried for revenge, so Clark sent a message to Fort Pitt, hoping for an Ohio rendezvous with those troops while he organized another retaliatory campaign from here at the Falls. Jefferson County's militia met the Washington and Lincoln County militias. There were but 3 militia groups, 3 county groups in Kentucky, Jefferson, Washington, and Lincoln. They met at the mouth of the Licking River in November 1782. And when the 1,100-man force turned north for Chillicothe, Floyd, Kenton, Logan, and yes, even Boone again rode with Clark. The Fort Pitt troops never materialized because Washington had been assured by the British that all, quote, savages had been called in from the Ohio River Valley by Detroit. But Clark hadn't received that notification, and so he made a sweep through the Shawnee villages before he returned to Louisville. At this point, his unreimbursed 1780 receipts, coupled with his new 1782 receipts, were mounting, and in light of his still unreimbursed Illinois expedition expenses, he was becoming increasingly short of cash. Next image, Emma. Hannah, thank you. In June 1783, a Virginia commission reviewed his accounts and reported the state owed Clark 3,400 pounds. That's a lot of money in 1783. But the new governor of Virginia wrote the following month only to inform him that the conclusion of the Revolutionary War meant that Virginia no longer needed a Western commander, particularly in light of the fact that the bankrupt state had ceded the Northwest Territory to the new federal government. Clark was out of a job, and only he seemed anxious about his financial situation. That fall, Clark and William Croghan, also now without a job, remember the Revolution ended, were named principal and deputy Virginia State Line surveyors. Croghan's fellow officer, Richard Clough Anderson, was selected as Virginia's Continental Line surveyor. And the 3 men opened their offices in Louisville in the summer of 1784. Anderson and Croghan will never have another employer. And each man now is going to spend months south of the Green River or in Ohio securing payment for Virginia's Revolutionary soldiers. Clark, however, was called to the federal stage almost immediately. He was named to an Indian commission formed to create treaties with the Ohio River Valley Native nations. He didn't want to do it, but Jefferson talked him into it. So he left in October 1784 for 3 months in New York City, and he participated in creating a temporary peace with the Wyandottes, the Delawares, the Chippewas, and the Ottawas in January of 1785. After that, he announced an autumn gathering of Native chiefs on the Miami River. That's just west of where Cincinnati will be. And it's also just yards from the site of Lockery's massacre. His messengers fanned out throughout the valley to tell natives to bring all their prisoners. Now this is interesting. Bring all your prisoners to the conference, black and white. So the natives were capturing the Virginians' enslaved men and women who were traveling with them as prisoners. The chiefs responded slowly. Croghan wrote for, Clark from Louisville saying, I'm sorry there's so little prospect of the Indians coming to the treaty. I fear they are more inclined to war. Remember, he's Irish. Last Friday, there was a man killed at Floyd's Fork, and Saturday and Sunday, 2 others in the neighborhood of Boone's. Now that's Painted Rock Station, today Simpsonville. So the commissioners and their military aides waited in Ohio. One of them kept a journal and wrote that when Clark was present, the great warriors who had arrived never noticed any other general. And when the Delaware chief, and he's an important one, when the Delaware chief arrived, instead of taking hold of Clark's hand, the man wrote, the 2 men gripped nearly at the shoulder and shook the left hand underneath the right arm, an expression of mutual respect. General Richard Butler was the commission chairman, and he also kept a journal while he was there. And he noted a change in Clark during this prolonged period of waiting. He wrote, "A mysterious something in his conduct which I cannot comprehend, or am I certain he can comprehend in himself, settled over Clark in 1785. The conference finally concluded on February 1st, 1786, after the reluctant Shawnees conceded to the terms. Their chief, Malantha, asked only that the Americans, quote, have pity on their women and children. As it happened, they did not. And within the year, Clark was pressed into an ill-advised Vincennes campaign demanded by Kentucky's militia leaders to relieve the citizens of Vincennes from retaliatory native attacks. Do you see how this just goes back and forth, back and forth? This is what it was for 40 years. Virginia no longer claimed Indiana, of course, and so Clark and some of the militia were unsure of their right to respond, but 1,200 men nevertheless arrived at the falls by September 10th. The more they talked about it, though, the more they worried. A week later, only 790 men remained. Clark sent Ben Logan to recruit some more volunteers, and he went on with the rest of the army heading for Vincennes. But without Logan's leadership, the Lincoln County men soon turned for home, even though Clark begged for just a few more days. The expedition did reach Vincennes, but the remaining officers agreed there weren't enough men left to continue. Sadly, they didn't disband before some of the militiamen began stealing from the town after their Louisville supplies arrived spoiled. And as he had done in 1779, Clark allowed the men to capture a merchant boat and retrieve its food supplies before he convicted 3 Spanish citizens of illegal trade. This is going to prove to be a really, really poor decision. He left 2 officers in charge of a small unit and came back to Louisville, but soon received word that Valentine Thomas Dalton, one of his remaining Vincennes officers, had stolen $20,000 in goods from a Spanish merchant. And when it seemed nothing more could befall this ill-fated campaign, Clark learned that Chief Malantha had been killed by Logan's men, and that Malantha's wife, Nanalima, Cornstalk's sister, had been taken to Danville as a prisoner. Clark and Richard Butler and Daniel Boone managed to have her released and compensated as a patriot and escorted to safety in Detroit, but she died soon afterwards. At the age of 33, George Rogers Clark removed himself from the public arena in 1786 and retreated to his parents' newly built home on Poplar Level Road. Most of us know it as Mulberry Hill. Meanwhile, and not coincidentally, a disgraced but ebullient Revolutionary War veteran named James Wilkinson arrived in Lexington from Philadelphia and immediately became active in Kentucky politics. He publicly championed separation from both Virginia and the United States. He wanted out of both. And in a secret agreement made in New Orleans with the Spanish governor, Wilkinson agreed to become a Spanish spy. Agent 13, if you can believe it. That the ruin of Clark's reputation was connected to Wilkinson's arrival was forewarned by Thomas Jefferson as early as September 1782. Now we're in 1786, but in 1782, Jefferson wrote to Clark, "I was a little surprised to find one person hostile to you as far as he has personal courage to show hostility to any man. You may know him by this description, as being all tongue, with neither head nor heart." James Wilkinson wanted to be Kentucky's first governor, or president. President would probably be better. And he had to destroy anyone who might be selected ahead of him. Letters suddenly began to appear in key hands throughout the country. suggesting Clark was about to attempt a Spanish coup, that he was a drunk, that he was worse. Humphrey Marshall, Harry Ennis, and Richard Taylor, all distant relatives, joined John Brown in asking that Clark be removed as Indian Commissioner and replaced by James Wilkinson, Richard Clough Anderson, or Isaac Shelby. Now I understand Shelby and Anderson, they were well known and they were Revolutionary War leaders. But James Wilkinson? Who was talking to whom? And to placate the irritable Spanish government in New Orleans, Virginia's new governor, Edmund Randolph, published a public apology for Clark's Vinson's actions, humiliating him. Clark responded tersely, "I respect the state of Virginia. Things will prove themselves." Randolph refused to reimburse Clark's 1786 Vinson's expenses, suggesting the receipts had been lost, to which Clark replied, "After suffering the fatigues that I've undergone bearing so many malignant pens, I yet have to pay large sums of money for supplies the state could not get credit for? A person might reasonably suppose that, of course, I must be unhappy." The Spanish government in New Orleans had closed the Mississippi River to American merchants in 1784, and so Westerners who now had to cross the Appalachians to reach Eastern markets were outraged. Pardon me, many Kentuckians were prepared to go to war with Spain over this, but some others thought that the colonization of the lower Mississippi would in itself threaten threaten Spain rather into submission. So in 1788, Clark offered Spain his services in creating a colony of desirable colonists or subjects along the west bank of the Mississippi. His letter stipulated some specific terms. He would become a Spanish citizen, he would govern the colony, and each colonist would be guaranteed 1,000 acres. But the colonists were not to be disturbed as to their religion. Remember, of course, Louisiana was in Spanish control. Spain was a Catholic country, and most of those men Clark planned to bring were going to be Protestants. He just didn't want to be in the middle of that back and forth with Spain. So he made it clear at the very beginning. Spain said no thanks, just as they also said no thanks to von Steuben and to Boone and to John Sevier, who had also made similar offers because they already had an American on their payroll and he was giving them much more than a few new colonists. Wilkinson. The Commonwealth of Virginia denied all of Clark's claims for reimbursement in 1791. And in 1792, he applied to the French Revolutionary government after France made a plan known to liberate Louisiana, Florida, and Canada from Spanish control. His access to Paris was facilitated through his brother-in-law, Dr. James O'Fallon, who was a friend of Thomas Paine, who lived in Paris throughout the French Revolution. So now you see the chain of communication. The French government considered Clark's proposal, as Paine reported, because of Jefferson's warm support. French botanist André Michaux, there he is, arrived at Clark's father's home. This is what's today, of course, George Rogers Clark Park on Poplar Level Road across from Audubon Hospital. Michaux arrived there in the early autumn of 1793. He was carrying letters of introduction from Jefferson and Kentucky Senator John Brown of Frankfort. The letters introduced Michaux as a man of science, but Clark already knew the true reason for his visit because he'd received a letter a week earlier from French Ambassador Edmond Charles Genet, who had written a florid letter. General, it is time that free Americans of the West are liberated from an enemy that is unjust as well as despicable. It is in you, General, that the direction of this honorable mission has been vested, and you will cover yourself in glory and earn the gratitude of a great many men whom you will have freed from tyranny. The Citizen Michaud will also hand over to you your commission of Commander-in-Chief of the Independent and Revolutionary Army of the Mississippi. George Rogers Clark was now a French revolutionary officer, and we've arrived at the part of the story you hear nothing about. And by the way, did Jefferson and Brown know Michaud's true mission? Genet's appearance in the United States alarmed Washington, who ordered Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson to warn the Kentucky governor that the federal government would mobilize to stop any French campaign that originated here. Isaac Shelby responded, "If it is lawful for any one citizen of the state to leave it, it's equally so for any number of them to do so." Makes sense. Clark informed Genet October 3rd that he was prepared to leave the United States and form an army to invade Spanish Louisiana for France. But he warned Genet that neither he nor the French government should do anything, quote, to injure the United States or give offense to their government. He didn't want to harm the United States. He didn't want to fight the United States. He simply didn't see himself as part of the United States. Clark's old Illinois regiment rallied. John Montgomery came from Clarksville, Tennessee, and from his Shelby County farm, Ben Logan wrote, "If it appears to be the general opinion that the interest of this country requires that a spirited enterprise be undertaken against the Spanish posts on the Mississippi, I have once more offered my feeble aid, knowing you are honored with a commission from France and are to be head of the business undertaken. I've taken leave of appointments in this state of the United States, and I do presume I am at liberty to go to any foreign country I please, and I intend to do so." So what are we learning here? That very little of importance has changed in Kentucky in the last 225 years. Yellow fever swept through the country that fall and sent everyone who could manage to do so into isolation. Isn't this timely? And so, as John Adams later wrote, the United States was saved from France. So yellow fever saved the United States from France. But notwithstanding the epidemic that's kept potential volunteers at home, Clark's French expedition ultimately was doomed to fail for several other reasons, not just yellow fever. First of all, France expected the United States to pay their revolutionary debt. It was $5.6 million in exchange for driving Spain out of Louisiana. In other words, they hired Clark to go take care of Spain, and in exchange, they expected to receive $5.6 million. That was never going to happen. Washington and Adams would both much prefer a Spanish presence in Louisiana to a revolutionary French one. Secondly, the ever-fluid French Revolution had turned violent, and even the South's most strident Francophiles were now a little leery of a French invasion. Most importantly, General Anthony Wayne had led an army, of course, against the Miami, Delaware, and Shawnee coalition near Toledo at a place called Fallen Timbers. And this resulted in the legal conclusion, not the factual one, but the legal conclusion of a frontier war that had raged since 1774. Now, we know Tecumseh is going to lead a confederacy against the government within the context of the War of 1812, but that's going to come in the future. And for the moment, Kentucky Indian raids essentially ceased, and Kentucky was about to enter a period of relative peace and prosperity. And finally, the 1795 San Lorenzo Pinckney Treaty opened the Mississippi River to commercial trade. And so there was no longer a reason for Kentuckians to go to war with Spain. In the interregnum between the creation of the Commonwealth of Kentucky and the acceptance of federal law by a majority of Kentuckians, and that was a period of time, Clark struggled to find footing. Still, he rejected a personal proposal from the governor of Canada asking him to lead an army of 2,000 men to take St. Louis, New Orleans, or Santa Fe from the Spanish, because, as Clark wrote the governor of Canada, he detested despots in general and the English in particular. He sent a bill for $4,805 to France when he was assured that the latest government was a stable one. And in 1798, he traveled to Philadelphia, the temporary national capital, to settle things with the French ambassador there. John Adams' administration held him where he was, quote, invited to give my resignation to the Consul General of France or to retire from the United States. I refused to do the former, but I believe I shall have to be obliged to do the second. Clark found his way out of Philadelphia, though, and the president, he said, of the United States gave the orders to have me arrested. But the detachment he sent to take me just happened to be attacked and disarmed by a certain number of men, volunteers that my old comrades had the time to assemble. I then withdrew to the west bank of the Mississippi. He was leaving Philadelphia, probably, knowing Clark, in the middle of the night. He was crossing the mountains on horseback. He was traveling by himself. Somehow he got word to his Illinois men, and they found ways to get word to men who were living in the territory, and they intercepted John Adams' federal troops and allowed Clark to get to Missouri. Clark escaped the U.S. and he took cover in the Spanish territory, and where he stayed until sometime in 1799, where he traveled, with whom he lived, or what he did there, I cannot tell you. When he returned to Louisville, his mother was dead, and the community no longer saw him as a hero. His younger brother, William, had to sell his father's farm to pay his brother's debts and followed George to Clarksville, where they lived among the veterans of the Illinois Regiment in relative obscurity. While William crossed the continent with Meriwether Lewis between 1803 and 1806, however, George Rogers found the final adventure that he hoped would bring him economic independence and restore his community standing at last. Next photo. George Rogers Clark was an amateur naturalist. He was a botanist, a geologist, and he had considered the construction of a canal around the falls since that day in June 1778, when he had led the men of the Illinois over the rapids in a breathtaking plunge on his way to Kaskaskia. Now, with the falls literally at his Clarksville dooryard, he formed the Indiana Canal Company with William Croghan, Kentucky and Ohio Senators John Brown and Jonathan Dayton, as in Dayton, Ohio, and several prominent local men and relatives who were made directors. And after 1805, when he had dinner at Locust Grove, former Vice President Aaron Burr joined the company, and here we see Aaron Burr. The men planned to cut a canal from Jeffersonville to Clarksville, and they actually received $120,000 and an official charter from the Indiana Territory to begin the work. This was a legitimate enterprise. Burr was enthusiastic about the canal, and Clark in particular. He wrote about Clark, "I never saw a man of so much natural capacity and general knowledge as George Rogers Clark." Think about that. The degree to which Burr was a serious investor rather than an adventurer seeking a more expedient way to ship supplies from Blennerhassett's Ohio Island to an Arkansas tract that he may or may not have purchased as a staging ground for a Spanish invasion is not known. I don't know it. Nobody knows it. In any case, the association with Burr ultimately ruined the company, and as we know, a canal was built around the falls several decades later, but in Kentucky rather than Indiana. So the last great hope, economic hope of his life, collapsed with the connection of the man he and William Croghan thought would make everyone in the country want to invest in their company. Aaron Burr. Late in 1808, Clark again applied for permission to build an Indiana canal, complete with wharves, mills, and storehouses. But before any action could be taken, he fell at his fireplace, severely burning his right leg, which had to be amputated in Louisville on March 25th, 1809. He was brought in June to Locust Grove, of course, the Louisville area home of his surveying partner and his brother-in-law, William Croghan, who'd married Lucy Clark, Clark's sister, in 1789. And George Rogers Clark never saw his Clarksville home again. So in summary, George Rogers Clark's post-war disillusionment doesn't really diminish his earlier triumphs, and his contributions to the United States rightfully continue to be celebrated. He may have been surprised by Vincent's newspaper's eulogy that summarized his end with, although he may not have felt his country's gratitude cheering his declining age, yet his country did not, nor ever shall, forget that he well deserved it. Nevertheless, Clark had been witness to too much brutality. He bore too much responsibility before time and experience prepared him. And the remoteness of place and position, coupled with the public humiliation of de facto poverty, had left him broken. He saw no role for himself in the United States Army, and unable to succeed in the place he had claimed, and bewildered by a government that appeared to him before 1801 to be the mirror image of British colonial policy, he could not find his purpose in Washington's or Adams' United States of America. The Clark family hired attorney George Woolfolk to settle all outstanding claims between George Rogers' estate in Virginia in 1831. Now, this is 13 years after his death at Locust Grove. A year's work resulted in the recovery of $25,000 owed Clark by the Commonwealth and an additional $6,500 owed by Henrico Circuit Court. Also, Clark owned 73,962 acres at the mouth of the Tennessee River, which remained outside the United States at the time of his death. His brother William purchased this land from the estate and founded the city of Paducah as the area's major commercial center. But George Rogers Clark benefited from none of this. So where do we find George Rogers Clark in history? We find him at the cusp of the 18th century American narrative, where the arcs of three European cultures met a 12,000-year-old civilization to produce a new nation, and where he will continue to be recognized as the United States' primary example of Western revolutionary command. That's it.
Yay! Thank you. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Everyone, thank you for staying with us. If you do have questions, we are going to go ahead and put them in the chat. So you can go ahead and type them in the chat either to me or to everyone. I do want to make two quick announcements. We are making a recording of this lecture, so we are going to be sending that out. If you're interested, you can let me know, or I'll just put it on our general list. And if you're not on our Locust Grove mailing list, you can sign up for the mailing list by going to our website, www.locustgrove.org, and scrolling to the bottom where it says sign up for the mailing list. All right, Gwen, are you ready for some questions?
Sure.
Okay, this one comes from Carl Flowers, joining us from Texas. Thanks for being here, Carl. Carl says, why do you think that George Rogers Clark has not received the fame down through the years as his other contemporaries like Daniel Boone or Davy Crockett?
Well, first of all, he did not travel with John Filson. Filson made Daniel Boone. I gave an interview not too long ago to another organization and pointed out that it's George Rogers Clark who was the leader of Kentucky. George Rogers Clark was the man who organized government, who organized military command. He was the leader of Kentucky. In Kentucky, however, we tend to think, because we all read John Filson's work, that it was Daniel Boone. Boone was a character. He was a trapper, and he was a philanderer, and he was a pioneer for sure. He was in the fight most of the time, but he wasn't George Rogers Clark. It comes down to you, Hannah. You're a marketing person. Clark did not have a good publicist. As for Davy Crockett, well, you know, again, Clark didn't live to go to the Alamo. He's the kind of fellow who would have, but he didn't get there. And the Alamo, being a shrine for the country, made all of those men famous. And he didn't have that moment.
As the marketing person for Locust Grove, I believe I am George Rogers Clark's current publicist. So I believe
you are.
You can get this book on Locust Grove's website, authored by the great Gwynne Potts, about George Rogers Clark. Our next question comes from Bill Kugler, who would like to know, where is George Rogers Clark buried? And there's a story there, I think.
Well, yes, of course, he was originally buried at Locust Grove, where he died. But he was moved in the 1860s to Cave Hill, because Locust Grove was sold out of the family hands. And although the last of William Cron's children, Dr. John Cron, for whom there is a drink named, I understand, did leave note in his will that that family cemetery would remain in place forever, it was ignored by subsequent owners. And so the family, Clark's nephews, had bought a plot at Cave Hill in Louisville for Jonathan Clark, George Rogers' older brother, and his wife Sally, and their children and whatever. And so it was decided that Clark would be moved to Cave Hill with Jonathan. Also, there was a movement underway to move Clark to Frankfort, where Daniel Boone and Rebecca may or may not be buried. And they were trying to gather Kentucky's Revolutionary era pioneers at the Frankfort Cemetery, and the family didn't want him to leave Louisville.
That makes sense. He's the father of Louisville, so that makes a lot of
That's
sense.
right.
And at Locust Grove, we do still have a cemetery. No one is buried there, and it's not in its original location. As I understand it, it was moved slightly inward for some development. But we do have some headstones and footstones representing members of the Cron and Clark family.
And you can go to Cave Hill and visit the cemetery of George Rogers.
And George Rogers Clark is near the rest of the Clarks, but the Crons are in a different plot.
Correct.
And you can visit Meriwether Lewis Clark Jr., the great nephew of Clark, and who started the Kentucky Derby. So
yes.
a lot of
it's full of people. Go to Cave Hill. Yes.
People are dying to get into Cave Hill. So Christopher Paget asks, what did George Rogers Clark have to do with the pioneers on Corn Island?
Well, aside from bringing them there and more or less abandoning them there, very little. They more or less globbed onto him, as I understand it. He wrote that he didn't really want them along, but he didn't seem to have much choice. And as it turned out, they were useful to him because by leaving them there, they created a place. And of course, that place at the falls became the city of Louisville. And he had Fort Nelson built there. Once Clark began spending some time at the falls, he began seeing it as essentially the Virginia and later the American settler equivalent of Detroit, in that it was the center of military and civilian activity. It took a long time for that to actually come to pass, as Daniel Boone pointed out after the Battle of Blue Licks. But sadly, I suppose, since you know, we haven't found anywhere else to go in all this time, my family was among those Corn Island settlers, and it shows you how really dull we are. They were coming west. They hitched a ride, and they became sort of his home guard while he was further west.
Corn Island doesn't exist anymore, right?
No.
Okay.
The dams took care of that.
Okay, but it's I think down near, it would be like on the river part of like 12th Street in West Louisville.
Yes, in fact, when they realized that the island flooded every year, they did come on shore, of course, and they were down around 12th Street.
Okay.
When they built Fort on Shore. Creative name.
Yeah, it's a great name. I've actually always really liked that name. It's more interesting to me than Fort Nelson. Mary Beth Fisher would like to know the story of Mulberry Hill. Where exactly was it located, and where does it still exist?
Well, no, it does not exist. It is, if you're familiar with Louisville, and you do know where it is, because you will undoubtedly know where Poplar Level Road is at Audubon Hospital. It's straight across from there at George Rogers Clark Park. If you're not familiar with Louisville, it is due south of downtown. It was nestled in between the Wilderness Road as it came into Louisville. And it was actually at the emergence, if you're on the Wilderness Road coming into Jefferson County, out by the airport was all swamp and nastiness, and full of all kinds of varmints, two-legged varmints, who were probably going to rob you if you went through there. And just as you got out of that and onto the clearing and into good farmland and right on the verge of the city, that's where Mulberry Hill was built. And Clark helped build it. And Jim Holmberg, I think, who is here with us tonight, told me that it may have been originally a one-story log building. It became a two-story building. And the photograph that we have of it shows a very, very dilapidated house, three openings across the front, a door and a window on either side, but it was gigantic. And Clark, when it was built in 1785, described it as perhaps the best place of all of Louisville. He thought it was a grand house, and of course he lived there as long as his parents lived there, and in fact until his brother sold it and they moved to Clarksville across the river.
I just so happen to have a copy of this very old pamphlet.
That's it. There you go.
But this is a picture. This is the only picture we have of Mulberry Hill. I believe this is a pamphlet that the Filson and Locust Grove put out a number of years ago. So that picture of the property. But it's interesting to see a two-story log house. I don't think we often think of two-story built in that way.
Well, it was huge. It was huge. And I love the idea that Andre Michaud was there carrying letters from Citizen Genet, and that the French and the Kentucky French invasion of Spanish Louisiana was planned there. You can go to the park and walk the grounds. John and Ann Rogers Clark are still buried there. And get a feel for it on some blustery November day, and you begin to hear them and feel them, and you can see the house, and it was a grand place for its time and place.
Yeah, it's just a really incredible thing to think about, and truly you do. Ann Rogers Clark and John Clark are buried there, as well as a willow tree that is my favorite apocryphal story about George Rogers Clark, that he did his riding crop there and a tree sprung up. So there's some element of Greek mythology in George Rogers Clark's legend at Poplar Level Road. So this one comes from William Oates. Hugh McGarry of Blue Licks notoriety was an officer with Clark on the Vincennes and Chillicothe campaigns. What did Clark?
The first Vincennes or the second?
Oh, I don't know.
Okay.
Bill, type in if you Vincennes or the second. Regardless, if you are familiar with Hugh McGarry, do you happen to know what Clark thought of him after?
I'm not familiar.
Okay.
I'm sorry to say. I'm sorry.
That's okay. William Oates, we're going to mark that down, and if we find out the answer,
Yes, let's try to find out.
we will look it up. We'll look it up.
Okay.
Another quick question. I think it should be, this is from Mary Beth Fisher. Are the Mammoth Cave Crogans the same Crogans as Locust?
Indeed, they are. Mammoth Cave was bought by George Rogers Clark's nephew, but William Croghan and Lucy's first son. And they are the ones who turned it into a tourist attraction. He tried first, of course, to make it a hospital because of the steady climate and humidity, and he was interested in treating tuberculosis. His patients died, and he said, well, Plan 2 is a tourist attraction. And in fact, his second brother, George, was instrumental in making sure Dixie Highway, when it was built, ran right by Mammoth Cave, so that it was easy for people in both Louisville and Nashville and all places beyond to reach the cave.
Mammoth Cave also has a lot of places that have names within our family tree. So that's fun to be like, oh, that's Lucy's space.
And the original map indicates that they named areas within the cave for family members. So, and Audubon Avenue was named Audubon Avenue because John James Audubon was also a Revolutionary War officer with William Croghan, and Audubon's son was a personal friend of the family, as was Audubon.
Yeah. So Audubon visited Locust Grove several times. We only wish we knew what happened to our version of Birds of America. That would be great.
He bought it.
I know.
There was a copy.
Caitlin Tisdale, who is our new Director of Education and Family Programs at Locust Grove, has the question, what do you think that George Rogers Clark's men thought of him throughout his campaign? Did they see him favorably?
You know, I can only, pardon me, I can guess that, but I have a personal connection to that too. For the most part, I think the men of the Illinois Regiment would have followed him to the end of the earth. My great, however many times, 8, 10 times grandfather was one of Clark's men. And I can tell you that when I was a little girl sitting on my grandfather's front porch in the swing, every night after dinner, I didn't want a fairy tale. I wanted another George Rogers Clark story. And my grandfather had them. He incredibly, many of them turned out to be true, but he had one story after another about Clark. He had those stories because his grandfather had told him, and his grandfather's grandfather had told him. Again, I think that those men would have followed him to the end of the earth. Look at what Ben Logan said. I've given up the United States. I've ended all of my business here. He had a farm in Shelby County, but he was going to leave it. He was walking away from it to go to the west bank of the Mississippi with George Rogers Clark. Really, doesn't that take care of it?
I always think of him as a pretty charismatic person.
He had to have been.
But he had to have been, but also if he was as handsome as he appears in the picture in our gallery, that is an artist's rendition of a young George Rogers Clark, just saying.
I think we generally take away about 40 pounds and add about 4 inches, but nevertheless.
His hair could not have been that short. I think this is our last question, or second to last question, excuse me. Why did GRC never marry?
Goodness, I don't know. I think that clearly he did have a financial problem, Now, what his psychological issues were, I can't guess. He apparently did have a lady friend at one point, because John Todd was here in Louisville writing to him in Kaskaskia saying, if I had something to toast you with, or toast your sweetheart, I would do so. So it sounds as if his lady was here in Louisville. It certainly wasn't the sister or the daughter or the niece or whatever of the Spanish lieutenant governor. The woman that Todd was referring to would have been here in Louisville. Who she was, I have no idea. And clearly, you know, good heavens, William Clark had to sell their father's farm and move over to Indiana because that's all they had to pay his debts, mostly from the last Vincent's campaign, because Virginia just wasn't going to do it. He didn't have any way of supporting a family. And again, back to status. Men did not marry, men of quality did not marry until they were able to support their families in such a way that would bring honor to them all. Look at William Croghan. He was 35, 36 when he married Lucy and built Locust Grove. Clark could never do that. Now, had he been paid, had he received the money Virginia owed him, had his land in Western Kentucky been able to be converted to dollars because it was actually part of the United States, he would have been a wealthy man. And he was wealthy on paper, but he wasn't wealthy in fact. And I do think that that probably played a large role in it.
Well, he certainly accomplished quite a bit. So, you know, he can't have everything.
He's the Revolutionary War Western commander. I think that's just
our final question comes from Edith Wheeler, who asks, is all of this information in your new book?
Yes, and much more.
And much more. Gwynne, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you to all of you, our wonderful participants.
You're welcome.
From all over. We're so pleased you were able to join us. And I believe our executive director, Carol Ely, would like to say a few words. Carol, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Am I here?
You're here.
A few words. Thanks everybody for coming. We've found this a very successful format once we got through some technical difficulties. So we thank you for coming and hope that you will follow Hannah's invitation to subsequent lectures. And we thank Gwynne, of course, for not just this talk, but for the book, which is really going to be an upgrade to our interpretation at Locust Grove because it puts Clark in the perspective that he's deserved all along. So thank you so much, Gwynne.
You're welcome.
Everyone, this concludes this evening's Living Room Lecture Series. Our next lecture series will be announced within the next week, so please stay tuned. We're very excited. It brings a little bit of some things we might be missing from Kentucky back into Kentucky while we're in this kind of unprecedented waiting period. That didn't mean anything, but let's just say the roses might run a little bit the first week in May. Our Living Room Lecture Series. We're so grateful also to all of our wonderful volunteers. Many of them have joined us this evening, and we're grateful to all of you for being with us from wherever you are, from your living room to ours, virtually and hopefully in person someday very soon. So until then, cheers everybody. Bye.